What is 5/6 minus 1/4? Here we have a fraction being subtracted from another fraction. If we want to subtract a fraction from another fraction, we need them to have the same denominator. But in this case, we don't. One has a denominator of 6 and one has a denominator of 4. Is there a way we can rewrite these fractions as equivalent fractions with the same denominator? Well, let's check and see. Let's make a list of some of the equivalent fractions to 5/6 and some of the equivalent fractions to 1/4. Then we can compare those lists and look for a common denominator. The first thing we want to do then is make a list of some of the equivalent fractions to the fraction 5/6. If we want to write a fraction that's equivalent to 5/6, we can multiply 5/6 by a fancy form of 1, and we'll get an equivalent fraction. In other words, we can multiply by some number over itself, and we'll get an equivalent fraction. Well, if we multiply by 2 over 2, then 5 times 2 is equal to 10. 6 times 2 is equal to 12. That means 10/12 is equivalent to 5/6. We could also multiply by 3 over 3. 5 times 3 is equal to 15. 6 times 3 is equal to 18. Or we could multiply by 4 over 4. 5 times 4 is equal to 20. 6 times 4 is equal to 24. Or 5 over 5. 5 times 5 is equal to 25. 6 times 5 is equal to 30. So these fractions here are all equivalent to the fraction 5/6. So these are just some of the equivalent fractions. The next thing we want to do is make a list of some of the equivalent fractions to the fraction 1/4. Once we make that list, we can compare it with the denominators in this list, and we can look for a denominator that's the same in both lists. Let's go ahead and do that now. Let's make a list of equivalent fractions to the fraction 1/4. To find fractions that are equivalent to 1/4, we can multiply by a fancy form of 1, or some number over itself. If we multiply the numerator by 2, we get 2. If we multiply the denominator by 2, we get 8. Or we could multiply by 3 over 3. We would get 3 over 12. Or we could multiply by 4 over 4, and we would get 4 over 16. Or we could multiply by 5 over 5. We would get 5 over 20. These fractions are all equivalent to the fraction 1/4. Now, let's compare the denominators of these equivalent fractions to the denominators of these equivalent fractions, and let's look for a common one. In other words, is there a denominator we see that's common to both lists? Well, let's look at the denominators for the equivalent fractions to 5/6. We have 12, 18, 24, and 30. Now let's look at the denominators for the fractions equivalent to 1/4. We have 8, 12, 16, and 20. Well, 12 appears on both lists. That means 12 is common to both, so 12 is our common denominator. Now, instead of writing 5/6, we can write it as the equivalent fraction 10/12. And instead of writing 1/4, we can rewrite it as the equivalent fraction 3/12. Then we have a fraction minus another fraction with the same denominator. We're ready to go ahead and subtract those fractions. So let's go ahead and do that. If we want to subtract these fractions, we said, instead of writing 5/6, we can write its equivalent fraction 10/12. Minus, instead of writing 1/4, we can write its equivalent fraction 3/12. Now we have a fraction minus another fraction with the same denominator. To subtract a fraction from another fraction, we take the numerator of the first fraction minus the numerator of the second fraction, or 10 minus 3, all over our common denominator of 12. 10 minus 3 is equal to 7, and it's all over 12. That means 5/6 minus 1/4 is equal to 7/12. And we were able to find this fraction by first making a list of some of the equivalent fractions of our two fractions. Next, we looked for a common denominator between those two lists. We rewrote our fractions with that common denominator, and we subtracted.